Hello, and welcome as this time we come to the 14th Sunday, or weekend of the Scripture, for our weekly celebrations of the B year. And the readings this time, the first comes from the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 2, verses 2 through 5, from the letter of Paul to the Corinthians, the second letter, chapter 12, verses 7 through 10, and the Gospel from Mark, chapter 6, verses 1 through 6a. All right, now remember, we are this time tracing the Gospel of Mark as it evolves over the next few weeks. Last time, one remembers that Jesus had successfully healed two women who had been suffering for a long period of time. Well, one had been, and the other, of course, had been at the point of death. So Jesus in chapter 4, he had been teaching, and 5 he had been illustrating healing. Now, as we come to chapter 6, returns to his hometown, or as one translator would say, has come to the fatherland. So we have a history of Jesus in other places. He now comes back to Nazareth, okay? Now, as he comes there, and keep in mind that often place of birth, and this would be, well, he wasn't born there, but certainly he had been raised there in Nazareth, was the basis for one's claim to honor. Mark really never tells us, remember, a story of where Jesus had been born. We are indebted there to the other two synoptics, namely Matthew and Luke, who gives us accounts of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. But Mark is not too concerned where Jesus was born or even when, but he is concerned about the mission of Jesus, and therefore he does not include that information. I simply remind us of that because we do tend to fill in blanks when we look at the total personnel picture of Jesus. Now, he comes back to Nazareth, and he is pictured here as a teacher on the Sabbath in the synagogue. So all of those are kind of interesting reminders. Now, when we come to a place like Nazareth, which was probably a village, keep in mind that the total population of a place like this was probably not larger than 150, at best 200 people. So do not think, we should not think of huge kind of communities or cities here, but really there were many of these small villages scattered throughout the Galilee, and this really was one of them. You remember that we have pointed out on other occasions that Nazareth was approximately about 4 miles from the place of Sepphoris, which was a rather large place being rebuilt during the time of Jesus. All right. Now, as he is greeted, he is welcomed. But there are a series of questions now that emerge as Jesus comes to Nazareth. They are, well, interested in where, and these are some of the questions that they will ask him. Now you can read the text, but notice that there is a kind of suspicion here. What is the origin of Jesus' teaching? What is the nature and origin of this wisdom that he has? How did he do mighty works in other places? They identify him by his occupation and by his household. Now, we are told in this account, and remember that one's basis for honor is from his birth, is determined by the circumstances of his birth. So he is understood here to be a carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James, Joseph, Judah, and Simon, and his sisters. Now, and there are a couple of questions that, again, because we're looking at this from a scriptural point of view, might be raised. Often sons are identified by the father. The fact that Jesus is identified by his mother raises some questions about his father, and some questions also about his origin. So the status that Jesus has here is that he is a carpenter. Now, not the son of a carpenter. That would be, and again, I mentioned that we need to keep in mind that Matthew and Luke kind of fill in or change some aspects of the story as Mark has told it. So if he is a carpenter, that makes him an artisan of some kind. We've mentioned before that carpenters were not simply workers in wood, although certainly they could do that, but they were also workers in stone and in other kind of necessary activities that kept a village going. Carpenter, in a certain way, would, I suppose, in a nice way, be considered a handyman, somebody who kind of could help out neighbors when they had particular needs that he would be able to surface and help. Now, the fact that they identify Jesus as the son of Mary has raised certain questions, and it determines here by how scholars will read this or interpret this, or how they interpret the reaction of the Nazarenes to Jesus. Some, and again, point out that this is not the only one, but some perceive this as a slur. By calling Jesus the son of Mary and not identifying his father, are they suggesting something about the origins of Jesus? Only kind of saying that that's a possibility. Why is the Joseph, who we understand from other traditions was the father of Jesus, not mentioned? Well, certainly one of them simply could be that he had died, but even if that were the case, why not mention that? So you see where this raises some issues. Others will say, however, in a unique way, that Mark is wanting to show that Jesus' tradition has a royal background, that he comes from a noble lineage, and that by naming, in this case, Mary, he is setting up a kind of, he comes from the Davidic line. We know he comes from the Davidic line from the other two writers, but not necessarily from Mark. So is that one of the kind of ways in which the Markan writer is doing this? It isn't clear, and I suppose sometimes it depends on where the emphasis wants to go. Certainly, Jesus, as I mentioned, is recognized as a craftsman, but they do take offense as to where does he get this knowledge? Now, Jesus, to kind of see where this is going, takes the offensive here by quoting a proverb. He says, "A prophet is not without honor," that means he is with honor, "except in his own country and in his own kin and in his own house." So he wants to kind of shame those who are seeking to shame him before they can do this. because he points out that rather than being an outsider to the Nazarenes, he is really an insider. Mark does not tell us, by the way, how the crowd reacts to Jesus' rejoinder, okay? Now, that Jesus has been named a prophet is interesting. Certainly stories by now, and that's why I mentioned before that we have the information in chapters 4 and 5, have filtered back to Nazareth that Jesus is a teacher and that Jesus has worked certain signs and wonders, particularly some healings. They should have, and probably did have, hear stories about Jesus and what he had been doing. So, why do they take offense at him? Because, in some ways, and we have pointed out in other instances, that a man's honor was given not simply by what he did, but was also rendered by how the community honored him. So they are saying, in effect, look, we never noticed that he was doing this teaching. We never noticed that he was a healer. What we did notice, and that's what we approve of, and that's what we support him in, are now really kind of concerned about this new way that he has been acting. See, hence the question, where did he get this wisdom? We don't think he learned it here in Nazareth. He may have been a regular attender at the synagogue, which certainly he would have been as he was growing up. And notice also that Mark starts his story of Jesus immediately with the message and mission of John the Baptist. So we know nothing of the early times of Jesus. We can only fill in the blanks of what, and that's all we're doing, of what went on when Jesus was growing up in Nazareth. All right. They do say to him, we know his mother and we know his brothers, and they are given names here, namely the four names. If we look at them carefully, we'll notice that these are names that belonged to biblical patriarchs. So, for example, Jacob, who was the father of the 12 tribes, you remember. So you have to always keep in mind that, like all the synoptics, they are familiar with the Hebrew Bible. Then Joses is often equated to Joseph, of course, who was remembered in the tradition as, in his own way, a savior of Israel back in those early days. Then Judas and Simon, who are also named sons of Jacob. So, is that a connection? That there is this rich biblical kind of connection here. The sisters are also mentioned, although no names are given. So we really do not know how many there were, who they were, and whether or not later on they actually became followers in Jesus' entourage. There are references, you remember, to women who followed in Jesus' group and who supported them out of their means, which is another interesting phrase to determine what exactly that means. So, they are offended by what Jesus has been doing. Now, this is the only gospel, this phrase of Jesus, that a prophet is not without honor except in his native place, is the only place in which the words are added among his own relatives and in his own household. The other evangelists later on, when using this quote, drop that reference. So again, we're looking, as we study these things, at the uniqueness of the Markan tradition, and this is certainly one of them. we are not sure what the reaction of the community to Jesus' teaching was. What one gets the sense is that they are not accepting him in his new role. And that's perhaps why the first reading comes from the writing of Ezekiel. Ezekiel has been, and as he says in the reading, God kind of told me to stand up and to give a word to Israel as a rebellious house, that what they are doing is not the right kind of thing, okay? Here's the contrast, I think, that the liturgists hoped to set up when they chose this Ezekiel reading, that Ezekiel speaks to a rebellious house of Israel. Jesus here speaks to a resistant leaders of Nazareth. Now, that's not exactly the same, but you at least can see the contrast. Part of Ezekiel's call here was that he was to be a prophet, and that the Spirit entered Ezekiel, and he stood up upright, and he speaks to the people who not only will not listen, but will actively oppose him. So again, the story of Ezekiel during the time of the exile of Israel, I suspect that maybe this is one of the reasons why this particular section of Ezekiel is brought to our attention. Jesus experiences, therefore, in the gospel, rejection by the populace of a city that he really had grown up with. And in that sense, his rejection is not expected. In a certain way, Jesus perhaps thought that his hometown villagers would be delighted that they had heard the stories about him, that here he was back with them. Here he was teaching, interestingly, in the synagogue. They were listening to him. Wouldn't they be happy about what he had done? And wouldn't what he was doing, despite the fact that originally, as I mentioned, they had improved it, was bringing honor to the Nazarenes. That's not the way in which this is played out. So Jesus here is checked in terms of what he will do, but not checkmate, if you can use the imagery from that game, because he will go on to continue to do good work. But this homecoming is very different than had been expected. So I know other questions would be, what about brothers and sisters here that I mentioned? I think we have perhaps noticed this before. There is no explanation in Mark given as to how that or they emerged, okay? So you notice that there's a lot of theological interpretation that later goes into how to explain these things. In our Catholic tradition, we are somewhat concerned with where they come from. Some say, I think we've mentioned this before, that perhaps Joseph had been married previously. These were sons and daughters that he had with another wife, and therefore when he died, they came over to this family. Well, that's a nice attempt to do this, and some writers like Augustine and Jerome like to suggest that maybe the term here, I've mentioned this before, rather than call them brothers and sisters, could call them cousins. Well, that stretches it a little bit and certainly has a different meaning than one suspects that Mark had in mind. So the hometown audience, therefore, is mystified and does not discern, and of course this is something that Mark is hoping that the hearers of his gospel will notice, that divine activities or the presence of God's commissioned agent is with them. So they have understood Jesus in one way. Now they are invited to consider Jesus in a different way, that something really has happened that affects Jesus, but also affects them if they accept him. We're not, as I say, not quite sure just how this will ultimately end with regard to Nazarene acceptance. A word on the second reading from Paul. We have been listening to the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, but he makes an interesting statement in the readings that we will hear this time. He says to the Corinthians, and remember that his relationship with the community at Corinth had at times been somewhat tenuous. We haven't talked a lot recently about Paul's situation with the Corinthians, but he had spent time with them and had some challenges with them. But in the reading that we hear this time, he says that a thorn in my flesh has been given to me, an angel of Satan, to beat me, to keep me from being too elated. And 3 times he says to the Corinthians, I begged the Lord about this, that it might be taken away from me. Now this raises the interesting discussion as to what exactly is the thorn that Paul has received in the flesh, it says. Now, I don't know where you picture the thorn in the flesh being given, okay? Some have said, if one used more colloquial English, that Paul is saying, I've been given a pain in the other part of the anatomy. Now, therefore, is this thorn in the flesh a physical ailment? Now, some say that that would be true, that in fact there is a theory that Paul received epilepsy, another illness, but we really don't have too many instances where that theory would have been easily played out, but that is one of the kind of thoughts that, in other words, he has received some physical suffering. He wishes, and those of you who, and us who suffer from physical ailments, perhaps at times wish, please take this away. I can't take much more. But another interpretation would be that someone is continually harassing or challenging Paul and his teaching, and that that's what he means by a thorn in the flesh. How do I deal with this person who continually challenges me, and in some ways, particularly when he's mentioning the Corinthians, talks differently about the message that I am portraying about Jesus. Now, Paul says in the reading that we will hear that the Lord says to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. And that is often a theme you remember again in other places, in other letters that Paul writes, where he says that although I may be weak, I nevertheless am strong in the ways of the Lord. But I did want to kind of talk a little bit about this thorn in the flesh, because it's an interesting phrase that one does discover in Pauline writing, in Pauline thinking. So those would be some of the concerns of this time. Once again, remember that perhaps because we have a moment or two, that when Jesus is growing up in Nazareth, and if he is an artisan, a carpenter, that the city of Sepphoris, which we mentioned earlier on in our discussion, was a city that had been destroyed sometime in the year 6 of the Common Era because of its rebellion against the Roman world, and it had been destroyed. And Herod Antipas, who then was the territorial ruler of the area, decided to rebuild it. And he wanted to rebuild it to be an example of, Greco-Roman style. So, therefore, he would need artisans, he would need workers to help in rebuilding it. And this may well have been where Jesus spent some time growing up, so that here he became familiar with the Greco-Roman world. And I mention this also because we're not quite sure what the education of Jesus would have been like. The fact that he would have grown up in a family speaking Aramaic or a form of Hebrew would make sense. But if he were working in Sepphoris, he would have therefore also been exposed to the Roman language and maybe even some of the Greek thinking. So that the education of Jesus, when we look to see how did he come by wisdom in a human way, may have come from some of these expeditions or workings that he was doing. Now, whether or not he was a carpenter alone or with his father, which also would have made sense, is also another discussion. As you know, Sepphoris then became an important city for Herod Antipas, along with the city down on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, of Tiberias. Archaeologists are working very diligently these days as uncovering Sepphoris. It is one of the more important and major archaeological digs or subjects in Israel today. It's turning out to be quite an amazing site, and so it gives us an insight, not so much perhaps into the life of Jesus, although certainly that might be some background to fill in, but also what life in the Galilee was like in the time in which Jesus was growing up. So all of that, again, kind of fleshing out from other information that we are able to look at and examine during the first third of the first century, which would be the time in which Jesus was growing up, and kind of the influences that would have affected him. Also, one can see that the Galilee, especially the area in which Jesus lived, would have been influenced by Roman presence, and why there was not a great deal of love, perhaps, for the Roman presence, because although stuff that was going on in Sepphoris may not have directly affected the Nazarenes, nevertheless, one can see that that might also have been part of their story and their experience. And to bring this now to a point, what expectations they may have had of Jesus when he was growing up. Now, he spent 30 years, so the tradition says, that's a significant part of his life. What was he learning? What were the values and what were the understandings of the region that were part of his story? So you see, although we don't have a great deal of information in Mark, I mention all of this as perhaps something to keep in mind when we look for the portrait of Jesus, and why, therefore, they are astounded that here comes a man who is a teacher, a prophet, who is working healing of various kinds, which was very different, so they would ascertain from what they were experienced and what they thought Jesus had experienced. Thank you for being with us, and we hope to see you again.